You know when you pull up next to another car at a stoplight and suddenly you start to think that you're moving forward again, but then actually you realize you're still stopped, it's the car next to you that's moving? Isn't that such an uncomfortable feeling? It's the feeling of relativity. Here at Truman, I work in the study abroad office, but before this, I was a Lutheran minister. And in that role, I experienced moving into a number of kinds of communities, from inner city Chicago to rural Nebraska to suburban Houston. And as I came into each one of those communities, as I transitioned in, I felt something kind of similar to that feeling in the car, the feeling of relativity, my relativity as an outsider in communities very different from the ones that I grew up in. And so, you don't have to move into a totally new community to experience that kind of relativity. I feel like we can encounter it in far more everyday kinds of ways. It can shock us and surprise us. So maybe you've experienced having to quickly make up an excuse when somebody asks you out for dinner on a Friday night because you don't have the money to go, and you experience your economic relativity. Or maybe you walk into a room and everyone there is wearing MAGA hats, and you realize you've got your Warren 2020 shirt on, and you experience your political relativity. Those kinds of moments can be uncomfortable, but my experiences coming into a number of types of communities has helped me to see that beyond that initial jarring feeling of relativity can come something else. Relationship, connection with people that we thought were most disconnected from us. So today, I want to talk about a journey that I took from relativity to relationship in just one of those communities, First Immanuel Lutheran Church in Chicago, Illinois. I first came there during my time at grad school at the University of Chicago, at the Divinity School, where I was studying to be a Lutheran pastor. I had just signed up for an internship at the Spiritual Life Office at my university. And I was feeling really comfortable about that because, first of all, I'd be working with people from the world that I occupied every day, my fellow students and classmates. I also felt like the role really suited my gifts. It suited my intellect and my academic interests, my love for in-depth conversations about the meaning of life. And so I was feeling really good about that. But that Sunday, I thought I would just find a place to worship, and I found First Immanuel online. And at first it seemed like it was going to be something very familiar. It looked like an old German Lutheran congregation. It was in this giant stone cathedral. And I was expecting something kind of like the church services I'd grown up in. Some familiar hymns and a pipe organ, the same kinds of rituals and motions, and a lot of people inside who probably would look like my distant relatives. But as I got to the church that day, as I opened that Gothic door into the stone cathedral, I suddenly realized that this was not going to be the experience I had expected at all. The people inside were not stoic-looking Germans. They were all black. And before I could even process my surprise, my shock in that moment, I was whisked away by an usher into the middle of this pew where I was surrounded by people who were laughing and singing and dancing to this loud, joyful gospel music. I wish that I could say that I'd been immediately swept up into the experience and just embraced it, but honestly, I'd be lying. I really wanted to run right back out the door. This was an uncomfortable moment for me. You see, beyond the surprise of just opening the door on a community that I hadn't expected, there was something more fundamental going on. To that point in my life, I'd simply never stepped foot in a black community. I'd also never been so surrounded by a group of people who so freely expressed their emotions. You see, I came from a culture with a very strong rule about emotions. Don't show them at all. Don't show them with your face, don't show them with your voice, don't show them with your body. And now here I was surrounded by a group of people who were showing their emotions with their amens and their hallelujahs. They had their hands in the air, they were dancing. And I was standing there in the middle of them like this tree, trying to stay rooted while a hurricane blew around me. I was so overwhelmed and uncomfortable, I was panicking. But you know what? As the service went on, I started to calm down a little. My panic started to subside. I stopped planning my escape route. And suddenly I started to feel something different. I started to feel myself swaying just a little bit to the music. I started to feel myself with these tiny little amens rising up in my esophagus. In short, I started to feel the invitation of the community of people around me to be a part of what they were doing. And that's when the scariest thing of all happened. This thought, this question popped into my head, and it wouldn't go away. It kept saying, what if you didn't do your internship at the university? What if you did it here instead? Could you possibly do that? Would they even want you? Could you possibly be a part of a community that feels so relative to you? In that moment, I was terrified because I knew the answer. My gut was saying I knew that I had to try. I had to try because I knew that it would challenge me. I knew that it would grow me. I knew that it would confront all of those assumptions and prejudices inside of me. In short, most of all, I knew that beyond the present discomfort that I was feeling in that moment was the possibility of a new kind of relationship to the people around me in that room. And that's how I came to practice my relativity at First Immanuel Lutheran Church in Chicago, Illinois, during a year that was one of the most challenging, but also rewarding of my entire life. During that time, as I practiced my relativity there, I had to return again and again to those initial experiences, to my fears and worries and anxieties, to lots of really super awkward moments, to questioning my own inner rules and assumptions, but also to these wonderful, intimate moments with people who had been strangers to me up to that point. My time at First Immanuel gave me this kind of roadmap to practicing my relativity that I want to share with you today in just 3 simple parts. Show up, shut up, and try it their way. First is showing up. So it took an accident to get me through the doors of First Immanuel, but it took discipline to keep coming back. Showing up in a place where we feel that kind of discomfort can be a little bit like the way they train astronauts when they hook them up to those machines that swirl them around over and over again so that they can acclimate to G-force acceleration. For us, I think sometimes it can just be such an uncomfortable thing in our gut that we need time to acclimate to being in places where we experience our relativity so deeply. At First Immanuel, that meant just coming back to that service again and again, sticking around for coffee and meals and conversations until the fears and anxieties in me started to subside. After I got used to showing up, I had to learn to shut up. And for me, that was mostly an internal process. I had all of these loud voices inside of my head constantly trying to shut down the process. These nervous, anxious, skeptical voices that kept reminding me how uncomfortable I was, saying, this is really uncomfortable, or we don't really do things that way, or I don't know, I've never really thought about it that way, that's kind of hard. Shutting up took asking those voices to sit to the sidelines for a minute so I could finally hear the new voices that were around me in that moment. As I did that, I started to hear the people of First Immanuel welcoming me into their lives, sharing their history and their stories with me. They started to show me their neighborhoods and invite me into their homes and even into their hospital rooms. As I shut up, those new voices around me started to enter me and go to work dismantling layers of assumptions that I'd built up. One of the most powerful voices at First Immanuel came from a man named Mr. Wallace. He and I had gotten to know each other during our time there. And he came up to me one Sunday after I had just delivered what I thought was an outstanding sermon. I had perfected the manuscript late into the night in the library like a good grad school student, and I thought it was outstanding. But Mr. Wallace, he came up to me after the service and he told me what he thought about it. He said, Will, that sermon told me a whole lot about what's in here and absolutely nothing about what's in here. In that moment, he confronted me in a way that showed how deeply he cared about me. In that moment, he challenged not only my sermon, but the whole culture that I came from that did value my intellect far more than what was in my heart. He confronted me with the values of his community that wanted to see something more raw and less calculated come out of me. In that moment, he saw clearly this whole part of myself that was still hidden from me. And he did more than silence me, he invited me. He called me to that third practice of relativity, trying it their way. That is, getting rid of the ways that we've learned and have been habituated in us to do things over and over again, and risking another way of being. As soon as I got used to shutting up, I started to hear the people of First Immanuel inviting me to try it a new way all the time through their encouragements. I did try to preach some sermons from my heart, and as I did that, you know what? I fumbled. But the people in the congregation would shout out, "Come on, preacher," to help me and encourage me to keep going. When Christmas rolled around, they asked me if I would be the angel Gabriel in the Christmas pageant. What they didn't tell me until after I said yes was that part involved wearing a giant white robe that was semi-transparent with a 50-foot train and dancing around the congregation. But you know what? I tried it. I danced my awkward, gangly dance right down the middle of that aisle, and they cheered me on with "Go Will, go Angel" as I did it. The more that I tried it their way, the more I felt that jarring feeling of relativity give way to relationship and connection with something much bigger than me. On one of my last days there, I was able to join hands with those very people who had so startled and shocked me on my first time through the doors. And we sang the old gospel spiritual, "We Shall Overcome." And in that moment, as I looked around the people that I was connected with, I knew that they saw me as I had come to see them, as brothers and sisters. First Immanuel was just the beginning of several more journeys into communities very different from the one I grew up in. After that, I went on to a very liberal congregation in Chicago, focused on social justice for the LGBT community. After that, I went to the polar opposite. I went to a town of 800 people in rural Nebraska, where everyone was a conservative farmer. From there, I moved to a wealthy suburb of Houston, Texas, where I was a pastor to a bunch of people who were very connected to the oil industry. In each of those places, as I've entered those communities, I've learned again and again that growth does not happen in our comfort zone. What happens there is isolation from people that we could be connected with. And beyond that, I've learned that those initial feelings when we're jostled out of our comfort zone, as we feel that jarring sensation of relativity, it's our cue not to run away, but to dive in deeper, to practice our relativity, to show up and shut up and try it another way. Because if we can risk doing that, we will find that the most unexpected people around us in this world can become our guides into whole realities and worlds and ways of being that we could never discover on our own. So get out there and practice your relativity. Try visiting a community on campus that feels like it's not for you, like an international students group or a diversity group, or even the college Democrats or college Republicans, whatever your political affiliation may be. Intern in a community that feels nothing like the one you grew up in. Study in a country you didn't grow up in. Take some time and befriend that one person in class whose every comment infuriates you. Find out why they think the way they do. Jump at any opportunity to immerse yourself in a community of people who don't share your social class, your assumptions, your political or religious ideas. In short, practice your relativity. Because it's not about perfection, it's about practice. So get out there and practice your relativity and let it give way to relationships all around you.